Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. So for today's little sketchbook session, we are going to be doing something with alcohol markers because I don't know if you guys remember the last session that I did, I accidentally put down a piece of sticker paper on the wrong side. So technically I can work on some kind of like a marker drawing on this particular right side of the spread, and then we can do whatever we want on the left-hand side. So while I kind of get things set up, let me talk about the sticker paper a little bit. So if you ever want to have a surface to work with markers and you want to block out any of like the marker bleed through, a lot of like matte sticker paper, just really simple sticker paper, usually works very well because it has a coating on the back and you can use it to cover up your sketches. Or if you want to do, I guess it might depend on what you want to work with, because some kind of like sticker papers don't really allow the markers to blend really well. Some might, but from my experience, I find it easier to just do any of like the drawing and stuff mostly in cell shading, just because I can't do a lot of blending on the sticker paper that I currently have. But for today's session, we are going to be working solely on the right hand side of my sketchbook because I already laid down a piece of sticker paper on the back side of this right side page. So because of that, I can work freely with the markers, and the coating and the sticker paper will just cover all the bleed through, and I can just use the normal sticker paper and draw on it as normal. Or if I really want to, I can, like I said, use alcohol markers on the opposite side and we won't have to worry about any of the ink seeping through. So for the actual drawing for today, we are starting off with the palette color ENO and the color red to do our sketch, just because I find it kind of like one of the softer colors that I can work with, and because I typically work with warmer skin tones, it blends a lot with the skin tones that I typically choose. But in terms of who I am drawing today, at the time of recording the video footage, I think for Alien Stage, Mi Vida Loca, let me check if that's even what it's called. Yes, that song just came out, and I think the artwork for it is super cute, and I really like the color palette. So I thought it'd be fun to kind of pick out some of the colors that are present in that color palette to make that kind of our main focus for today's illustration. And I kind of just want to play around with the colors. So I am drawing Till from Alien Stage. If you know nothing about Alien Stage, I highly recommend just looking it up. I'm sure if you're in kind of like the anime sphere or even like the K-pop sphere, you probably heard of Alien Stage to some degree or have seen artwork of it, because I think there's like a lot of crossover. It has like a bunch of great music, so I highly recommend that if you are interested in kind of like K-pop or Korean music or anything like that, definitely check it out. So with the sketch of Till being finished, let's go ahead and move on to line work. So I think alcohol markers is almost one of the only times I really do line work prior to doing any of the coloring. So I'm using the water-based markers from Magicfly. So these have a brush tip on one end as well as a fine liner on the other. And I find that none of my markers really smudge with any of these water-based markers. I don't know if it's because of like water and alcohol, they don't really mix, but I like using these because I have like a plethora of colors, and oftentimes I can make my line art appear more soft at first, and then we can darken up whatever lines we want later on and just kind of like take it from there. So for this one in particular, I ended up choosing kind of like a mid-tone red to start with our line art, and then later on I will choose a different color to kind of give more contrast, to darken up some lines, and just to kind of push it a little further, because the monochromatic kind of mid-tone color that I typically choose, it becomes very almost like washed out and appears very soft, which is nice if that's what you're going for. But typically whenever I do line art, I do like a little bit more contrast with the colors. So I only chose red mostly because, one, it matches, like I said, kind of with the skin tone color range, but there's a lot of red within kind of like the color scheme in general for the most part. And it's mostly present like with the little hearts and stuff in the background, and there's like a patterning on Till's shirt and his sleeves, but you don't really get to see too much of that. So I wanted more red to be present, so we are going to use that for our line art for now. But whenever I'm doing like line art, usually also like when I'm sketching sometimes, if I know I want to push it further, I will add some areas that have more like line width variation to push the contrast, add a bit more depth to my lines prior to doing coloring, because coloring will do quite a bit of heavy lifting. But once I add in our secondary color for our line art after we finish coloring, that's when things are going to like really start to pop. And I think coloring wise, it was definitely a little bit more of like trust the process, because I was a little bit scared with the color selection that I chose for Till's skin. Oh, actually, let me talk about the lines for a little bit. So I kind of like was fiddling with the sketch when I was drawing Till at first, and I had his hair a lot longer in the very beginning, and then I started to kind of shorten it, because I typically draw shorter hair still like somewhat long, and I make it like stick out and kind of fluff out a bit. But Till's hair sometimes is hit or miss for me in terms of how I want to stylize it. So I think the right hand side makes a lot more sense than the left hand side. But then when I started doing the line art, I continuously started to shrink it a little bit more and more on the one side, and his hair looks almost like lopsided. So it's not my favorite, but it works out, at least in the end for the most part. I don't think it doesn't look like Till, but it still has some iffy parts, I guess. But after we finish with the line art, which we are, I go ahead and take a kneaded eraser and just erase mostly around their face area. Till does have like a bit more of like a lighter color aesthetic. His hair is kind of like white to gray, as well as his shirt. So I want to make sure that all of that is kind of cleared up so that we don't have any red lines just smeared across. So before I color any of Till, I wanted to make sure that I was going to get the color palette kind of like down right off the bat, and there's a significant amount of yellow, and that yellow is not exactly present in Till's particular color scheme. It's just present in terms of like the overall color of the illustration that they used for the album artwork. Or I guess not even the album artwork, it's just the artwork for the song. But I wanted to knock out the yellow because I wanted some sort of starting point, because I knew I was not going to use the typical combination of skin tones that I was going to use, because one, they're running low, but two, I didn't really want to make everything too pink per se. So we are going to use more of like yellowy or type of colors for this particular piece. So after I did the background, which is just like a very wobbly lined little rectangle behind him, I am adding the red or pinks, a little bit of orange to kind of do our little heart in the background as well. I think I would have liked to add more of like a shadow, and I didn't really do like a good job blending for the most part when it came to any of like our gradations for our heart and stuff, as well as like anything on the left hand side technically does have a sheet of sticker paper placed. So like I said earlier, it doesn't really do a good job of blending, but it does work well with like alcohol markers if you just want to prevent like bleed through, or you want like a solid place of color. It still works quite well. I don't think I really showed it on the screen, but I pre-chose colors, and I was actually scared that the color that I chose for Till's skin tone was too yellow. And like I mentioned, I wanted to place down the yellow of our background first because I was scared I was going to make everything too yellow by using something that was a little bit less peachy, rather than like something more pink and stuff, which I typically like to use. Also, it's gonna look very intense for quite a while because I wanted to make sure that Till's face also looked like it was blushing, which is kind of like present in the artwork that this is kind of like based off of, as well as just like the general vibe of the song, because Till is like in love. So, you know, I wanted to add some sort of like cute expression. I do want to have like a little bit of a gradient of like a deeper red to a flesh tone all the way down to, I guess, like our yellowy base. But luckily, the base of his skin tone doesn't look too yellow on camera, but also in context with our yellow background, it doesn't look super intense. Because initially when I was doing like the swatches on the left hand side, it looked way too yellowy, like jaundice is what I'm talking about at this point. But slowly adding like more reds here and there, having a color to kind of bridge it a little bit between our gradation. I don't think the yellow looks too bad, so hopefully it doesn't look too off and it kind of feels like a more cohesive coloring job together alongside with the yellow in the background. So one of the main reasons I really love this color palette is, I've talked about this a lot, I love the color combination of like anything that's like green, teal, mint, turquoise, up until like blue, paired with anything that's like orange, yellow, and red, or like pink-ish, in that kind of color sphere. So because of that, I loved the contrast between a yellowy greenish color, which is kind of like, it's more supposed to be like white, but with all the colors in combination, you can kind of get away with using like almost a pale minty green with a little bit of yellow sprinkled into there, and in contrast with like a lot of red. It's just eye candy for me. So I just really wanted to play around with the colors as much as I could. I tried using a little bit more of like a bluish green to do our shadows back into his shirt because it was looking a little bit too dull, and I wanted to bring out a little bit of more of that blue, since I do have like that cyanish color strip right next to the left hand side of Till. So I wanted to keep everything cohesive as I could, and I'll just start to like really deepen a lot of the colors and try to push a little bit more of the depth here and there, but trying to keep the color combination and color theme kind of like all in mind because I don't want to stray too far from it. Then we moved on to working on Till's hair. So one thing I don't really like about this particular drawing is that his eyes are a little bit off kilter, like they're slightly off. Part of it is usually when I do line art, I don't really notice that my sketch was not like perfectly aligned. This often happens when I accidentally tilt the face more back to being like straight on, and I've already drawn like the eyes at an angle, so they often look like one is really high compared to the other one. And then part of it also is like the spacing due to the bangs covering a portion of the eyes. It probably just looks a little bit more off center than it actually needed to be. But back to the hair. The hair, I did a very similar combination of colors that I did to his shirt. I don't remember if I ended up adding much of the yellow back into his hair. I can only hope that I did, but I'm kind of like waiting and watching myself like during the footage portion and seeing if I actually did end up putting some of that yellow in. I did not use technically the same colors as I did in a shirt. It's just kind of like similarly, I guess like in the hue of it, because the base I think was the same, but then I switched to more of like a grayish green bluish color because Till's hair is not exactly, I don't know, would you consider it white or would you consider it more like a gray? I kind of wanted to mute it a tad bit here and there, and then I ended up adding a little bit of a skin tone to some of the edges just to give it like a crisp of warmth to the edges. But other than that, I decided to take out a paint marker to bring back a little bit of highlights for our little heart in the background. I also used it to clean up the inside of his mouth because I accidentally got some of the skin tone there. After that, I went ahead and used the Magicfly marker once again, add our blush lines with a ruler, added a little bit of a blush tone alcohol marker to go over our lines just to make it a little bit more softer and give that glow to it. Then comes my favorite part. So I went back to our little swatch sheet and picked out a color that I think would work well as like a contrasting color. And I try to keep in mind of picking one, like a dark color. Oh, I guess I also accidentally colored his sleeve to be the same color. This would have made sense, I think. Till's outfit, I actually don't really remember if it's supposed to be dark or if it's like he's wearing like a one solid colored long sleeve shirt, but I somehow colored it as like a very monochromatic look and then realized that it's supposed to be red, so I decided to darken it up here and there, add a little bit more of like a hole to our heart. But let's talk about the line art again. So because I'm doing the second phase of the line art with a secondary darker color typically, I do think about how the colors will look next to each other, but also like mixed. So because I'm layering and going over the already initial line art color, I do have to be a little bit conscious of what I already put down. So in this case, I use, like I mentioned, the kind of like a mid-tone bright red, but this time I'm using like a green. So when it's mixed together, and the green is like significantly darker, so it is going to be very much like overpowering. So it's not too much of like mixing versus just having super high contrast. But oftentimes I would use like a red, and if I wanted something a little bit more subtle, I would use a purple to darken it, and then have the combination of the red and purple mixing to have like a softer look. Or if I want higher contrast, I could use like a darker purple. Or in other cases, I will use like a dark blue and make it really pop, because at a glance, it appears more like black, similarly to how I'm using the green on top of this red right now. But like some areas that I add like a thinner line work, hopefully to kind of like transition the color a little bit from our dark color back to our red. It'll just make it look a little bit less like out of place. And that's sometimes like something I worry about whenever I'm doing these darker line works on top. I never really have the intention of adding the darker color on every line that I've already placed down. One, it's time consuming, and two, it kind of feels redundant if I were to cover everything with the dark green color that I'm using, because at that point I should have just started with the dark green. But I like having areas of where it's just that solid red color. I mostly put my attention towards like areas that I think needs that more sense of depth. So a lot of it is like any lines that tend to converge or touch and make like a point. So I'll darken up those areas to push the contrast as much as I can. Sometimes I do like the dotted line method if I want to like break the line. I did it mostly with like the red color in his hair and like I think in his fingers, but I don't do it as much with the darker color, just because sometimes the lines do get a little bit, I don't know, it just looks like a splotch of color rather than like intentional, if that makes sense. So I don't do it too often with the darker color, unless I know I want to break the line where the red is like kind of like alternating with our green. Hopefully that kind of makes sense to some degree. But like at the end of the day, it's the main purpose of me doing like a secondary color is to pull out some of that contrast. And the reason why I do it by, I guess, how do I explain this? I technically could, if I wanted to, start off with the red and immediately go in with our dark green and start to pick out our shadows and our colors that way, and then color everything in. But I like being able to see the entire piece at its full, like with full color, so that I know where I want to place the contrast the most. So I like doing that line art at the very end. But we are finished with Till. I ended up doing doodles on the left-hand side later, but I don't show that on camera. But you can kind of see the color swatches that I was working with for the most part, and the kind of like minimal bleed through or like ghosting that you can kind of see, just because the paper is a bit like translucent in the light, so you might see a little bit of ghosting. But Till is done. Hopefully you guys enjoyed watching today's video. I like this color palette a lot, so I would probably doodle with this kind of color palette maybe in the future or something, maybe 3 markers. But I will talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!